I knew trouble was coming the moment I saw the first sign staked into the dirt at the edge of my property. Coming soon, Aspen Ridge, a premier luxury community. The words were printed in bold gold lettering, shining obnoxiously in the morning. Son, below them, in smaller print, brought to you by the Aspen Ridge Homeowners Association, HOA. The three worst letters a man like me could hear. I sat in the cab of my truck, staring at that sign like it had personally insulted my ancestors. I had a bad feeling about this. And when a man grows up on land that's been in his family for generations, he learns to trust his gut. A week later, the woman arrived. Her name was Patricia Carmichael, but from the moment she strutted up my driveway in a pressed white blouse and heels too expensive to be walking on dirt roads, I only ever thought of her as the Queen of Aspen Ridge. She knocked twice on my front door, then, without waiting, cupped a manicured hand over her eyes and peered through the glass like she owned the place. I stepped out onto the porch before she could start rattling the doorknob. "You the homeowner?" she asked, looking me up and down with a polite, tight-lipped smile. "Something like that," I said. Her eyes darted to my boots, then to the dusty jeans I'd worn to fix the fence that morning. I could see her calculations running, trying to decide if I was worth her time. "I'm Patricia Carmichael, president of the Aspen Ridge HOA. She enunciated each letter like it was a badge of honor. "We're developing the community just south of your—" She hesitated, sweeping her gaze over my ranch. "Property." "Yeah, I saw the sign," I said. "Nice of you to warn me before planting it on my land." She didn't blink. "That's why I'm here. There seems to be a discrepancy regarding the boundaries. According to our plans, part of your fence extends into Aspen Ridge." I folded my arms. That fence has been there since my granddad put it up. If there's a discrepancy, it's on your end. A flash of irritation crossed her face, but she masked it quick. "We'll need to discuss the proper adjustments. Our community has strict guidelines to ensure everything is uniform, structured, and fair for our homeowners." "You realize this ain't part of your HOA, right?" Her smile tightened. "Yet." That was the moment I knew she wasn't just another pushy bureaucrat. She was dangerous. The first note came 3 days later. A single sheet of paper, typed and printed, taped to my mailbox. Notice of non-compliance. In bold letters, it listed violations on my property, unapproved fencing materials, unauthorized agricultural activity, failure to maintain a uniform aesthetic. Snorted. Aesthetic. The land looked exactly as it always had, rolling green fields, an old red barn, and the sturdy wooden fence that had stood for decades. I crumpled the paper and tossed it in the bin. 2 days later, a new one appeared. Second, notice, urgent fine, $500 for fence violations. Fine, $750 for failure to remove unapproved structures, the barn. Immediate action required. That one got a laugh out of me. She was fining me for having a barn on a ranch. I ignored it. That's when she escalated. First, the surveyors. They showed up unannounced, walking my land with clipboards and measuring tapes, muttering about reassessment. I ran them off, with a few sharp words, and the loaded weight of my shotgun resting in my hands. Next came the legal threats. A letter from the HOA's lawyer, claiming I was encroaching on their property, demanding I cease unauthorized land use immediately. But the final straw, the moment I knew this wasn't just a nuisance, but a full-blown war, came on a cool Thursday morning. I woke to the sound of an engine idling outside. Patricia stood at the edge of my driveway, arms folded, watching as a crew of contractors measured the foundation markers for the first homes in Aspen Ridge. On my land, I stormed out the front door. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" She didn't even flinch. "Breaking ground," she said smoothly. "The board approved the project. I suggest you move your fence before construction interferes." I took a slow breath, willing, myself to stay calm. "You don't have the right," she smiled. "That's for the courts to decide." And that's when I realized she thought she had me. She thought I was just another nobody standing in the way of progress. She had no idea what was coming. I clenched my jaw as Patricia Carmichael smirked, standing there with her designer shoes planted on my land like she owned the damn earth beneath them. I glanced at the workers, some of them shifting uncomfortably under my glare, but they kept measuring, driving stakes into the soil. Their trucks were parked right up against my fence line, one of them already unloading materials for the foundation. I took a step forward. "You move so much as a single clump of dirt on this side of that fence, and we're going to have a real problem." Patricia's lips pursed, her expression a careful balance between condescending and amused. "Now, Mr. Carson, it's Luke." She continued as if I hadn't spoken. "This is already a legal matter. If you want to fight the HOA, I suggest you hire an attorney. Otherwise, the board will have no choice but to proceed." I tilted my head. "Board, huh? Or just you?" She gave a breathy laugh, like she couldn't believe she had to deal with someone so unreasonable. "I represent the community's best interests." I let my gaze drift toward the brand-new neighborhood behind her. The towering cookie-cutter homes built where open pastures used to be. The land had already changed more than I cared to admit. But this was too far. I exhaled slowly. I had no doubt Patricia had greased all the right palms to make this mess look legitimate on paper, but I also knew something she didn't. This land wasn't just mine. It was my grandfather's, and my grandfather never lost a damn thing without a fight. That night, I dug through old records in the attic. Dust swirled in the dim light as I flipped through brittle papers, old survey maps, yellow deeds. I knew my grandfather had never sold this land. He'd talked about it too much, had too much pride in keeping it whole. So how the hell was Patricia's HOA claiming part of it now? I nearly gave up until I found it. A bundle of old maps and property, surveys, signed and dated. I traced my finger over the boundary lines. My fence was exactly where it had always been, but according to these records, the land that HOA was building on wasn't theirs to build on. It still belonged to me. I sat back, heart pounding. They had no legal claim. None. I had them, but I had to be smart about this. Patricia had the HOA, lawyers, the whole damn system behind her. If I didn't play this right, she'd bury me in paperwork, stall the courts for months, maybe years. No, if I was going to take her down, I needed to be strategic. I needed to let her think she was winning. Patricia wasn't one to waste time. Next morning, a certified letter arrived, another final warning from the HOA, demanding I move my fence off Aspen Ridge's private land within 7 days or face legal action. I stood in my kitchen, rolling the paper between my fingers, staring at those typed-out threats. She was pushing harder now, testing how much I'd take before I broke. Good. She wanted a fight? She was going to get one. That afternoon, I drove into town to visit the best real estate attorney in the county. His name was James Holloway, and he was a no-nonsense 60-year-old pit bull of a man who'd been dealing with land disputes longer than I'd been alive. I spread the old surveys out on his desk. "Tell me what I already know." Holloway adjusted his glasses, flipping through the records. "Where'd you find these?" "Up in my attic. My granddad kept everything." He let out a low whistle. "These maps are ironclad. The HOA doesn't own an inch of that land. If they're building on it, they're trespassing." "That's what I figured." I leaned forward. "What's my next move?" "Well," he rubbed his chin, "we could go straight to court with this. Get an injunction, halt construction. But," he gave me a knowing look, "but if you want to really take her down, you let her keep digging her own grave. Let her get comfortable, let her commit." I nodded slowly. "Make her think she's won. And then?" Then, Holloway said, leaning back with a smirk, we hit her where it hurts. By the time I got back to the ranch, another surprise was waiting for me. Patricia. This time, she wasn't alone. Two uniformed county inspectors stood beside her, arms crossed, looking like they had somewhere better to be. I climbed out of my truck, taking my time. Something I can help you with? Patricia's expression was pure satisfaction. Mr. Carson, we've received multiple complaints regarding code violations on your property. One of the inspectors cleared his throat. Sir, under county ordinance, structures on private land must meet certain... I held up a hand. Let me guess. My barn, my fencing, my agricultural activity? Patricia gave a pitying sigh. We're simply trying to ensure our community is held to the highest standards. This isn't your community, she smiled. That's not what the county records say. I clenched my jaw as one of the inspectors pulled out a clipboard. She'd gone to the county, put my land under a microscope, probably filed every nitpicky complaint she could think of. She was tightening the noose, and I let her. I kept my face neutral, nodding as they listed off nonsense violations, barely listening. Patricia watched me. The whole time, gauging my reaction, waiting for me to lose my temper. I didn't. I just let her keep digging. That night I got a call from Holloway. You were right, he said. Patricia's HOA filed all their land claims based on a new survey. That survey? Done by a firm she personally hired. That wasn't a surprise. What's worse, Holloway continued, is that she's already pre-sold the homes they're building on land they don't legally own. I stiffened. Now that was interesting. If those buyers found out they'd bought a home on land that wasn't legally the HOA's, that would destroy her. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly. Patricia thought she was winning. She had no clue she was already standing on stolen ground, and if I played my cards right, I was going to let her build herself a house of cards, just so I could burn it down. The next morning I woke up to the sound of hammering. It was coming from the other side of my fence. I stepped outside onto my porch, arms crossed, watching as a crew of construction workers pounded stakes into the dirt. Concrete trucks rumbled in the distance, and a foundation was already being poured where open pasture used to be. Patricia wasn't just moving forward. She was accelerating. She wanted me overwhelmed, drowned in paperwork, fines, county inspectors, breathing down my neck. She wanted me scrambling while she pushed ahead. I could almost admire her determination. Almost. I strolled down my driveway just as Patricia pulled up in her pristine white SUV, stepping out like she was surveying her kingdom. She barely spared me a glance. "Morning, Luke," she said smoothly, flipping through a file folder as she walked toward the workers. "You seem busy," I said, voice even. "Deadlines to meet," she replied. "Our buyers expect their homes to be move-in, ready by the fall." She was trying to get them built fast, probably because she knew, deep down, that something wasn't right. She just didn't think anyone could stop her. "You sure you want to rush this?" I asked. She turned, raising an eyebrow. "Why wouldn't I?" I let a slow smile tug at the corner of my mouth. "Just seems risky. Would be a shame if something complicated your plans." Her eyes darkened for a fraction of a second before she masked it with a thin-lipped smile. "I think we both know you're the one with problems, Luke." She snapped her folder shut, tilting her head at me. "For instance, have you checked your mail today?" I hadn't, but I already knew what she was hinting at. Patricia didn't just push, she buried. Sure enough, when I got back to the house, my mailbox was stuffed full of letters. More violation notices, more fines, more thinly veiled threats from the county. She'd reported me to every local authority that would listen. Zoning violations, environmental infractions. Hell, she even filed a complaint about livestock odor. She wanted to drown me in so much bureaucratic bullshit that I'd throw up my hands and let her take what she wanted. I exhaled through my nose, placing the stack of letters down on my kitchen table. Let her push. Let her dig. She was too blinded by power to realize she was sprinting toward the edge of a cliff. A few days later, I got a call from Holloway. "You're gonna love this," he said, his voice practically humming with amusement. "Lay it on me. Remember those home buyers? The ones buying houses on my land? Yeah, well, Patricia's been marketing Aspen Ridge as an exclusive private community." I frowned. And? And she's been advertising it as a gated neighborhood. I blinked. "She's building a gated community on land she doesn't even own," Holloway chuckled. "Not just building it, selling it. Buyers are paying premiums for what she's calling secluded luxury housing." I let out a low whistle. "That's bold." "It's fraud," he corrected. "And if those buyers find out they're about to move into a legal nightmare," I sat back, gripping the phone a little tighter, "they'll tear her apart." Exactly. I drummed my fingers against the table. This was the crack in the foundation I'd been waiting for. The perfect way to turn the heat up without tipping my hand too soon. Patricia wanted control. Let's see how she handled losing it. That afternoon, I made a few phone calls. It wasn't hard to track down some of the future Aspen Ridge homeowners. Patricia had been bragging about her exclusive community all over local real estate forums. I got in touch with one of the buyers, a man named David Calloway. He and his wife had just sold their home in California, planning to move into Aspen Ridge that fall. "So, Mr. Carson," he said once I introduced myself, "why exactly are you calling me?" I smiled, even though he couldn't see it. "Just thought you might want to know a little extra information about the land your new home is being built on." There was a pause. "What do you mean?" "Well," I said, stretching the moment, "you did sign a contract saying you were purchasing a home inside a private gated community, right?" "Yes." I let the silence drag just long enough. "And did Patricia happen to mention that she doesn't actually own the land those homes are being built on?" Dead silence. "Excuse me?" "Yeah," I said. "Turns out the property boundaries are in dispute, and from what I can tell, Patricia's selling homes on land that legally belongs to me." David's breath caught. She never said anything about that." "Course not. But if I were you, I'd have a real good chat with my lawyer before I hand over a down payment." He cursed under his breath. "You're telling me I could be buying a house that isn't even legal?" "Not just you," I said. "All of you." Another pause, then, "How many people have you told about this?" I smiled. "Just getting started." By the next morning, Patricia knew, because when I stepped outside to feed the horses, her white SUV was already parked in my driveway. I walked up slow, watching as she climbed out, her usual mask of confidence slipping at the edges. "Good morning," I said casually. She didn't smile. "We need to talk." I leaned against the fence. "About what?" Her nostrils flared. "You know exactly what." I shrugged. "I make a lot of calls." Her eyes flashed. "You're deliberately interfering with the Aspen Ridge development." "Am I?" She took a step forward. "Do you really want to play this game, Luke?" I met her stare. "I don't play games, Patricia." A muscle ticked in her jaw. For the first time she looked rattled. Good, because she had no clue what was coming next. Patricia squared her shoulders, lifting her chin. She was trying to regain control, but I could already see the cracks. She had the look of someone who had been certain they held all the power, until they realized their grip was slipping. She just didn't know how far she was about to fall. "I don't appreciate what you're doing," she said, voice tight. "And what's that?" I asked, crossing my arms over my chest. She exhaled sharply through her nose. "Stirring up unnecessary panic among my buyers. You and I both know there is no real issue with the land." I let out a short laugh. "No real issue. Patricia, you're selling homes on property you don't own. That's not an issue. It's fraud." Her lips pressed together. "There are processes in place to handle disputes, but what you're doing, calling my buyers, spreading misinformation, that's defamation." I cocked my head. "You planning to sue me for telling the truth?" Her silence spoke volumes. She wasn't stupid. Taking me to court would mean dragging everything into the light, and that was the last thing she wanted. Still, She wasn't backing. Down. Not yet. You're making this difficult, Luke, she said finally, her tone shifting, less sharp now, more calculated. I recognized the tactic. When force didn't work, manipulation came next. I don't see how, I said. I'm just a simple rancher, minding my own business. Her lips curved slightly, though there was no real warmth to it. That's just it, isn't it? You don't have to fight this battle. You could walk away, and I could make that very worth your while. I raised an eyebrow. Are you offering me a bribe? Her smile didn't falter. I'm offering you an opportunity. Sell the land to the HOA for twice its market value. You wouldn't have to deal with any of this. No court battles, no fines, no stress. I let the silence stretch, watching her squirm just a little. Then I leaned in slightly. See, that's funny. Her eyes narrowed. What is? If you were so sure you owned this land, you wouldn't be offering me a damn thing. Her expression flickered, just for a second. There it was, fear. She knew she was standing on stolen ground, and now she knew that I knew it too. I took a slow step back. You have yourself a nice day, Patricia. I turned and walked back toward the house, leaving her standing there, seething. The moment I shut the door behind me, my phone buzzed. It was Holloway. Got some interesting news, he said. I'm listening. Remember that survey company? Patricia used to redraw the property lines. Yeah, well, turns out they've got a history of errors. I frowned. What kind of errors? The kind that happen when someone pays them enough. That caught my attention. You saying the HOA's land claims are based on a fraudulent survey? Wouldn't be the first time. This same company's been caught doctoring records before. And get this, Patricia's personally connected to one of the execs. I felt my pulse quicken. You're telling me we've got proof of a paper trail? Oh yeah, emails, wire transfers, it's all there. I exhaled slowly, gripping the phone tighter. Patricia hadn't just overplayed her hand, she had just handed me the knife to cut her throat. I spent the next few days letting Patricia sweat. She knew something was coming. I could see it in the way her contractors were moving faster than ever, like they were trying to get as much built as possible before the storm hit. I didn't stop them. I let her dig deeper. Meanwhile, Holloway and I kept gathering ammunition. We pulled county records, bank transactions, old legal disputes. The more we found, the worse it got. Patricia wasn't just cutting corners. She had built an empire on lies, and it was all about to crumble. The final nail in the coffin came the following week. I was out fixing the fence line when I saw two unfamiliar cars pull up to the Aspen Ridge Development Office. Men in suits. I knew government agents when I saw them. I leaned on the fence watching as they stepped inside. They were in there a long time. And when they finally came back out, Patricia was with them. She was pale, talking fast, her hands moving in sharp, agitated gestures. The men didn't look impressed. She was scrambling, and that's when I knew. Her past had finally caught up to her. That night, I got another call. From Holloway. She's in deep, he said, his voice thick with satisfaction. That survey company, they're already under investigation for fraud, and now that we've tied them to Aspen Ridge, she's got nowhere to run, I finished. Exactly. The county is going to have to investigate the entire development now. If that survey was falsified, the HOA's entire claim to that land is invalid. I ran a hand over my jaw. And what happens to all those buyers? Holloway let out a low chuckle. They're going to be very unhappy when they find out they signed contracts for homes that might not legally exist. I grinned. Guess I should let them know. The next morning, I put the final piece of my plan in motion. I sent out a mass email to every single Aspen Ridge home buyer. It was short, simple, just enough to light the fuse. Subject: urgent, your home purchase. May be affected body. To all prospective Aspen Ridge homeowners, it has come to my attention that there are ongoing legal disputes regarding the land. your future homes are being built on. Documents suggest the HOA has been selling properties it does not legally own. I strongly encourage you to consult your lawyer before proceeding with your purchase. Best, Luke Carson. I hit send. Then I sat back and waited for the explosion. That afternoon, Patricia showed up at my ranch again, but this time she wasn't smiling. Her face was flushed, her movements sharp and erratic. She marched up to me, her eyes flashing with something just shy of desperation. "What the hell have you done?" she hissed. I crossed my arms, told the truth. She let out a sharp breath, her hands trembling. For the first time, she didn't look in control. She looked like a woman on the verge of losing everything, but she wasn't out of the fight yet, because what she said next made my stomach go ice cold. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," she whispered. "If you don't back off, you're going to regret it." I stared at her, and in that moment I realized something. She wasn't just desperate, she was dangerous. Patricia stood in front of me, her perfectly curated image slipping. The Queen of Aspen Ridge had cracks in her crown, and she knew it. But she wasn't going down without a fight. Her breath was sharp and uneven, her hands clenched at her sides, nails digging into her palms. The confidence, the control, was gone. What was left was something much darker. I could see it in her eyes. She wasn't going to let this end cleanly. "You need to drop this, Luke," she said, her voice low and cold. I exhaled slowly. "Not happening." Her jaw tightened. "I have powerful friends, people who can make your life very difficult." I tilted my head. "More difficult than you already have." Her nostrils flared. "You don't understand how things work. You think you can just—" "What?" "Win. Take everything away from me." She took a step closer. "This is bigger than you." I let a slow smile spread across my face. "See, Patricia, that's where you and I disagree." Her lips parted to argue, but before she could speak, her phone rang. She stiffened. I saw the flicker of hesitation in her eyes before she yanked it out of her pocket. She answered with a sharp, "What?" I didn't need to hear the other side of the conversation. I saw it happen on her face. Her skin paled. Her lips parted slightly, her fingers tightening around the phone. She turned away, pressing it to her ear, her voice hissing, low and urgent. Then her entire body locked up. What do you mean they're pulling out?" A pause. Her back stiffened. "They can't know. No, you listen to me." Another pause. I heard the frantic edge creep into her voice. "What do you mean they want their money back?" And there it was. The collapse. The buyers were pulling out. I folded my arms and leaned against the fence, watching it unfold. Her breathing had gone shallow. I'd know, this isn't happening. But it was. She whirled to face me, her expression wild. "You did this." I shrugged, told the truth. She let out a sharp breath, her fingers shaking. I could see it hitting her all at once. The homes she was building, worthless. The investors she'd courted, gone. The legal battle waiting for her. Unavoidable. Everything she'd built was burning, and she was out of water, her hands curled into fists. Her breath came quick and unsteady. Then she did something I didn't expect. She laughed. It was short, sharp, and bitter. She shook her head, staring at me like I was something beneath her. "You think you've won," she whispered. "You think this is over?" I held her gaze. "Oh, Patricia," I said, voice steady. "This is just the beginning." Her face twisted into something. Ugly, real, raw hatred. For a second, I thought she might lunge at me, rip me apart with her bare hands. Then her phone rang again. She hesitated before answering. This time, she didn't speak, just listened. Her face turned ashen. The HOA board had just called an emergency meeting. She was being removed. Her reign was over. Patricia slowly lowered the phone. Her fingers trembled. She looked lost, like she couldn't believe this was happening to her. Then, without another word, she turned and got into her car. She didn't slam the door, didn't peel out in some dramatic rage. She just left. The fallout came fast. Once the buyers started backing out, the dominoes fell hard. More people came forward with complaints demanding their money back. Patricia's personal finances were tied up in Aspen Ridge, and when the development went under, she went with it. The HOA turned on her, blaming her for everything. They thought that cutting her loose would save them. It didn't. The county launched a full-scale investigation. Between the fraudulent surveys, the bribed officials, and the broken contracts, the HOA was finished. And Patricia, she tried to fight. She hired lawyers, claimed she was the real victim. She pointed fingers at everyone but herself, but it didn't matter. By the time the dust settled, she had lost everything: her power, her reputation, her home. Aspen Ridge was dead in the water, and my land, still mine. A few months later, I was at the feed store when I ran into one of Patricia's former board members, a guy named Richard Lawson. He looked sheepish, shifting from foot to foot. "Guess I owe you an apology, Luke." I raised an eyebrow. "For what?" he sighed. "I should have spoken up sooner. Patricia had us all convinced that, well, that you were the problem." He shook his head. "She had us fooled. I didn't say anything, just let him sit with that. Anyway," Richard cleared his throat, "some of us, the remaining homeowners, we're looking at forming a new HOA, one that's fair." He gave me a hopeful look. "Would you be open to working with us?" I let out a low chuckle. "Richard," I said, clapping a hand on his shoulder, "I'll tell you what I told Patricia." He blinked. "This ain't your community." I left, him standing there still trying to figure out what the hell that meant. A year later, Aspen Ridge was nothing more than half-built ruins on land that would never belong to it. The houses were abandoned, their frames left to rot. The investors had cut their losses. The homeowners who stayed, they formed a new HOA, one that actually worked with the community rather than against it. The land remained, the fence remained, my family's legacy remained. And Patricia? Last I heard, she left town. No one knew where she went. Didn't matter, she wasn't coming back, not after what I did to her. And if she ever did, well, she'd learn real fast that some lines shouldn't be crossed. Not in my town, not on my land, never again.